Hello, and welcome to What on Earth, the podcast of the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA. In recent years, Nigeria has been revealed as Africa's main transit and export hub for trafficking elephant ivory, pangolin scales, and other wildlife. But now the country has taken serious steps to address the problem. I'm Paul Newman, EIA Senior Press and Communications Officer, and today I'm very pleased to welcome onto our podcast special guest Wilson Ogoke, Wildlife Policy Coordinator with one of our in-country partners, the African Nature Investors Foundation, to talk about what's being planned and how effective the country's new strategy may prove to be. Joining us are EIA Wildlife campaigners Philip Rekret and Justin Gosling. Welcome all, and thanks very much for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Paul.
Hi.
Thanks, Paul.
Good to have you guys. Wilson, perhaps I could start by asking you to give us a bit of background on why Nigeria in particular has become a hotspot for wildlife and forest crime and what the current situation in the country is like.
As you know, there is a strong link between deforestation and high levels of poaching, and that in turn fuels illicit wildlife trade. And for a long time, decades even, that was a situation across most of Africa, and that led to local extinctions of many of Africa's iconic wildlife species. So you have extinctions of rhinoceroses, for instance, African forest elephants, and I think African elephants in general became threatened. But over time, I think from international pressure, the laws and law enforcement really started to get better in the southern and eastern African countries. And when this started to happen, the criminal networks perpetrating these crimes started to shift their attention to Nigeria, to the point where Nigeria actually became the primary hub for consolidation and trafficking of illicit wildlife sourced from across Africa. Organizations who look at this sort of crime, like Environmental Investigation Agency, in several of their reports, have pointed out that the reason these organized crime groups find Nigeria attractive is because of Nigeria's challenges with corruption, and also because of its rather enviable position, as a transport and finance and banking hub in the West and in the West African sub-region. So the situation got really there, and the evidence is really clear because Nigeria's elephant population is rather small. According to some reports, between 600 and 700 individuals, scattered across the country. And but when you consider this alongside or side by side the huge ivory seizures from the country, it becomes glaringly clear, that Nigeria's borders are porous, uncontrolled, and that allows illicit wildlife products to pour into the country from across Africa. Unfortunately, compared to the really huge scale of this problem, Nigeria's response has been fragmented, has been very poorly coordinated, has not been proactive. And this has made it really difficult for law enforcement action, investigation and prosecutions, to reach the people who are behind these criminal networks. Also, the laws in general have been weak, and also Nigeria faces general challenges, with administration of criminal justice, and this has tended to show up when you look at the criminal justice response to this crime. So for instance, Nigeria's reports to CITES show that there were about 44 ivory seizures made in Nigeria between 2011 and 2018. Out of those 44 ivory seizures, there were only 3 recorded convictions. And my understanding is that these people just paid the fine and walked away. In addition to that, there was also a near absence of coordination and cooperation, with other countries who are affected by this crime. So, for instance, although much of the illegal ivory and pangolin scales trafficked through Nigeria end up in Vietnam, until recently there was really no effort, from the Nigerian side to reach across to Vietnamese authorities, and work with them to address this issue. And so, to put it in context, 21% of all ivory moving from Nigeria from Africa to Vietnam originated from Nigeria. And despite that, there was no cooperation between Nigeria and Vietnam. The same is the situation with Nigeria and other neighboring African countries like Cameroon and Gabon, and from where these illicit, ivory wildlife products are sourced. Thank you.
So, do you think it'd be a fair summation to say that when enforcement efforts improved in other African countries, that wildlife traffickers saw Nigeria as a bit of a softer touch, somewhere they might find it easier to do business, and obviously that became a problem of itself? Yeah.
Yes, that's part of the challenge, because they were sort of looking for the easy way out, and that was the opportunity for them.
Excellent stuff. Oh, Philip, last August, EIA and the African Nature Investors Foundation, or ANI for short, jointly released the report Combating Wildlife Crime in Nigeria, an analysis of the criminal justice legislative framework. Could you tell us how that came about?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So something that's really important to understand, and that Wilson kind of hinted at, is that Nigeria is essentially the Wild West of wildlife trafficking on the continent. And this is a result of many factors Wilson was discussing, including corruption and porous borders. However, based on our engagements over the last few years with government officials and other relevant stakeholders in Nigeria, we really believe the primary challenge in the criminal justice response is a lack of understanding of essentially, the laws and regulations that already exist that would be relevant or useful to prosecuting wildlife trafficking. So when I say laws that could be useful or relevant, I don't just mean laws that are related to wildlife protection. I'm also referring to other very important laws, for example, related to money laundering, corruption, customs offenses, organized crime, extradition, and judicial processes. We've known for a long time that countries find it difficult to combat wildlife trafficking and other organized crimes because of the ability of criminals to exploit weaknesses and legal loopholes, especially in the gray areas that exist where the mandates of multiple agencies kind of overlap, as is the case in Nigeria. So we wanted to carry out a really comprehensive analysis of the suite of laws and regulations, both federally and in key states, that are relevant for an effective criminal justice response, with our objectives being, one, identifying existing legal tools that could be applied today to addressing wildlife trafficking, and two, identifying key gaps and legal loopholes in the current legal system and suggesting recommendations to overcome these in the future.
Excellent. And what were the key findings of that analysis?
Sure. So with a lot of help from Wilson on the ground in Nigeria, we spoke with officials from all of the relevant government agencies, including prosecutors, investigators, judges, and studied any relevant legislation we could find. So first, and this has become one of our main priorities following the completion of the analysis, first is to review and draft an amendment to the current Endangered Species Act. At the federal level, the laws relevant to wildlife trafficking are really weak, especially when compared to other countries in East and Southern Africa. This has been progressing well, and we've recently drafted a pretty significant amendment to this act, with thankfully a lot of support and backing from the Minister of State for the Environment. Next, Nigeria is a federation of many states, with each being a semi-autonomous political unit, but in many cases the federal and state laws are not aligned, providing another loophole that criminals can exploit. So a further recommendation is to harmonize the state and federal laws to achieve parity. Now, with respect to investigations, there's clearly a need for investigator training and standardized protocols or codes of conduct for things like seizures, arrests, detentions, and interviews, particularly within customs, who, as the authority who make the majority of seizures, handle most of the cases. Similarly, there's a significant need to build the capacity and really increase awareness of the issue with prosecutors and judges. We interviewed many prosecutors and judges, but none had ever seen a wildlife crime case. And so awareness of the applicable laws was virtually nil. What else? Nigeria is well behind the global norm in terms of the digitization of case files and things like central databases for previous arrests and convictions. We heard from some prosecutors that unless the accused had been sentenced previously in that particular courtroom, there was almost no chance of identifying recidivist offenders. Finally, the focus in the short term should be on making the best use of the existing legal framework using a multi-agency coordinated approach. Currently, the best laws for prosecuting cases involving large-scale seizures aren't the wildlife-specific laws, but actually customs and money laundering laws. So we need to provide support and try to encourage key agencies to work together. So I'll just conclude by saying, it's really clear that the challenges to improving Nigeria's ability to combat transnational wildlife trafficking are really immense and numerous. But the key really lies in cooperation between the various agencies, increased awareness of the scale and nature of this issue, and significant revisions of the Endangered Species Act.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Phil. That's a very comprehensive look into it. Now, following on from that report, Nigeria, I understand, recently launched its first ever national strategy to combat wildlife and forest crimes. Wilson, what makes this strategy a significant milestone for Nigeria, and how has it been developed?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, and as Philip also mentioned, when he was speaking just now, Nigeria has not always performed optimally when it comes to living up to expectation with its international and domestic obligations to, combat wildlife and forest crimes. So this strategy is a significant milestone for Nigeria because it is the strongest statement yet from Nigeria that despite its well-known shortcomings, in this area, that it takes its obligation very seriously and that it wants to actually tackle these crimes. But that is a statement of intent. It also serves as a warning, to the criminal networks who are carrying out these crimes, and their enablers within Nigeria, that the era of trampling all over Nigerian laws is over. In terms of development of the strategy, the process was coordinated by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the UNODC. It entailed a lot of consultation and collaboration with and between key government and non-government stakeholders. I think the idea is that these consultations and collaborations will continue, especially when the document comes up for review after 5 years.
It seems to have taken some trouble to be very inclusive, to be getting as many voices from within the country as it needs to be credible. Is that the case?
Yes. It was quite. There was a workshop. There were validation meetings. There was really a broad-based effort to try and hear from as many stakeholders as possible.
Thank you for that. Justin, if I could bring you in here, what role did EIA and the ANI have in the creation of this strategy?
Well, as Wilson's mentioned, there was quite a bit of collaboration behind the scenes to try and get this moving. But I think it's quite important to acknowledge that sort of as the wildlife traffickers have moved into Western Central Africa, and that's recognised, so have the organisations trying to tackle it, including, of course, EIA. So there's a lot of organisations now in the region working to support changes in policy and legislation and enforcement on wildlife trafficking. So you've got organisations like Born Free Foundation, Wildlife Conservation Society, Wildlife Justice Commission, Focus Conservation, and we try and keep in touch with all of those as appropriate to try and make sure we're not duplicating effort and that we're working as collaboratively as possible. But as Wilson said, the UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, really played quite a significant role in consulting with various stakeholders and coordinating the launch. But I think where EIA and ANI can contribute, particularly now, is to try and make sure this strategy is implemented, that the findings lead to something, because we often see policy and documents developed. We've seen this for a long time in sort of global wildlife trafficking. The key is whether or not they actually turn into implementation and turn into something meaningful. So I think that's something we need to work hard on and make sure this comes to fruition, which could take many years to come into effect, really.
Absolutely. I guess you can have the best blueprints for a car in the world, but it's not going to go anywhere until you start putting wheels on it and stuff.
Exactly. All the wheels will come off, I suppose, one way or another.
So what else has EIA been doing in Nigeria and in Western Central Africa in partnership with the ANI? I gather we've got a bit of a history together.
Yeah, well, quite a lot. I mean, we've been pretty busy on a number of activities, and I think, if I can sort of speak for EIA, I think we're very fortunate to have ANI as our partner in Nigeria, because I think that's incredibly important from understanding how the country works and knowing the best local contacts and to get that work done locally. But we've, as I think Philip mentioned, we've led the review of legislation, which is now contributing to the revised Endangered Species Act, and the work to try and drive that through is ongoing, like right now, and we hope that will become law in the not too distant future. In February, we held this capacity development and roundtable event for investigators and prosecutors and judges, and that helped, I think, them to understand the challenges of wildlife trafficking In some cases, they'd never heard a case relating to wildlife trafficking. So there was definitely a situation where they just didn't appreciate why this was even important. So that really helped with that. But I think also likewise, it helped us to understand the needs of those key implementers in the country, so that we can, going forward, we can look at what they need. So we're now planning some work in Nigeria to develop skills of key agencies in financial investigations, using specific anti-money laundering techniques against wildlife traffickers, and get national agencies and the banking sector to work better together on financial investigations to combat wildlife trafficking. And then the EIA Intelligence and Investigations team is working almost round the clock to gather information and intelligence on wildlife trafficking, and where appropriate, we'll pass that information to specific agencies to act upon, or to look at and develop their own investigations into persons of interest. So, and some of our work is leading to prosecutions, and we're trying to monitor those to try and make sure they come to a successful conclusion as well. So there's a lot going on. That's just a bit of a snapshot, but there's a lot more going on in the background and planning for the future as well.
That sounds really encouraging. Wilson, from your perspective, how important are local partnerships when it comes to tackling issues as potentially massive as transnational wildlife and forest crimes? I mean, these are crime streams that are worth many billions a year. I presume there's some advantage to working with other organizations from other countries.
Yes, this draws from what Justin just said. It's not just about having policies, and documents in writing. Is all about implementation. And this is where local partnerships, with Nigerian NGOs like ENI play a crucial role, because they are on ground. They do a lot of work to hold their government accountable, and ensure that the government lives up to, its obligation to combat wildlife and forest crime. And if this strategy is to be viable and actually translates to something that, yields fruitful results in terms of combating wildlife and forest crime, it must continue, it must enjoy the support and constructive engagements of NGOs and other local champions. Secondly, local partnerships are also important, because as a document, this is the first national strategy document for Nigeria. So really, there are no baselines. Understanding of the crime is still very poor, very weak, and so the document itself acknowledges that one of the first key steps will sort of be to gather and analyze data, to understand the crime, to set baselines for implementation. And you have different agencies, working on different aspects of this crime. So it's essential now that the local partners and everyone else come together, and share their records and ideas. And then it's also really important to pool resources to ensure that the strategy is properly implemented, because wildlife crime is quite a dynamic and complex crime. That requires a lot of extensive, if you like, multi-disciplinary or multi-sectoral resources, both within and outside Nigeria, to tackle effectively. So no one organization within Nigeria can by itself, mobilize and deploy the full range of resources that are necessary to actually combat this crime. So for instance, to give example of the government agencies, while Nigerian Customs play a very crucial role, in detecting and disrupting wildlife trafficking, especially at the borders, they don't have the mandate or resources, to carry out the sort of financial investigations, that you would need to actually identify and dismantle the criminals who are committing these crimes.
You've touched already on a couple of aspects that are like key challenges when it comes to implementing this strategy, the need to have a very clear picture of what's on the ground, etc. Are there any other key challenges you would anticipate face Nigeria when it comes to putting this strategy into practice?
Well, the first and most significant one is It's the issue of the legislative framework, which Philip has already spoken about. It's enough that the national strategy provides for multidisciplinary national stakeholders forum, an operational task force, that will sort of be the implementing arm for the strategy. But then they have to still work with the legal framework that remains weak, and inconsistent, and which tends to hamper cooperation, and breed unhealthy rivalry. So unless these laws are actually harmonized, and some of all the recommendations really, of the legislative analysis which EIA and ANI carried out are implemented, it will be difficult for these agencies to sort of cooperate in the manner that the national strategy envisages. Funding is another significant challenge. Most of the agencies that are tasked with implementing the national strategy are underfunded, and also the activities themselves will be very costly to implement. Nigeria on its own continues to have challenges with corruption, and this can make it very difficult to mobilize the necessary resources it would need to implement the strategy. And then importantly, there is also the problem of captive breeding of endangered species, which is known globally to provide the cover for criminals to launder illicit wildlife. Well, unfortunately, after acknowledging that captive breeding programs, can be used to launder illicit wildlife, the national strategy goes on to say Nigeria will decide its position on captive breeding. If Nigeria follows through on this to introduce captive breeding programs for, threatened species like pangolins, this will clearly, go against the objectives of the strategy. It would undermine Nigeria's fulfillment of its obligation under CITES and other, international agreements. And then finally, Nigeria is facing a myriad of security and economic challenges. So it remains to be seen whether the political leadership of the country will be willing to prioritize the implementation of the national strategy, when it comes to allocation of economic and security resources.
As Justin said, this isn't going to happen at the stroke of a pen or overnight. It may well end up taking several years to put into effect. But assuming optimistically that it's going to all go full steam ahead and we're going to get what we want, what would that look like to you in a few years' time? What major changes would you want to see?
Well, again, Justin has mentioned the first step is that the foundation has to be right. And so successful implementation, firstly, will mean that Nigeria has the right kind of laws, that will sort of be the foundation for a consistent and coherent approach, in the work of the agencies that are actually tasked with combating these crimes. Fortunately, there is some momentum already in this area, because at the directive of the Minister of State for the Environment, Sharon Ikeazo, EIA and ANI, collaborated with the Federal Ministry of Environment, and as Justin already mentioned, to draft, the language for legislation that can address some of these challenges. And a priority going forward is for us to try and secure the amendment of this legislation. And then, again, one of the objectives of the strategy is to assess, capabilities to combat wildlife crime. I think this still goes back to the issue of sort of understanding the crime and drawing baselines. So this will involve activities like ICCWC toolkit assessment, which the UNODC will be leading. A successful implementation, one of the key, outcomes will also be when agencies begin to come forward to acknowledge their capacity gaps, and closely related to this, we will also need to start seeing concrete steps in terms of, implementation, in terms of actually addressing those capacity gaps. And ANI has already, started work in that area as it were. It actually anticipated the strategy. And so, as Justin mentioned, we ran a meeting in February this year, for judges, prosecutors, and investigators in collaboration with the UNODC. And that helped to raise the profile of the crime. Finally, successful implementation will mean better law enforcement outcomes, and that is in terms of proper investigations, proper prosecution, high rate of conviction with commensurate deterrent sentences.
Okay, one final question for everyone. How confident do you all feel that this strategy will be able to go a significant distance towards eradicating wildlife crime from Nigeria? And I guess also, does it feature any mechanism to address problems such as corruption, unhealthy rivalries between government agencies, and even the actual cost, as Wilson mentioned, of rolling it out? Perhaps, Wilson, you'd like to go first for that one?
Well, I'm not sure that Nigeria will ever be able to completely eradicate wildlife crime. Because Nigeria is still very much a country where people live, directly off wildlife and forest products, but you will always have people who break the laws. You can't, that's always going to be there. But I think with proper implementation of the national strategy, we'll begin to see that the mandated agencies, start to enforce the law, and to prevent important biodiversity from going extinct, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa. So effective implementation will ensure that Nigeria will stop being viewed by criminals as a soft spot, as the easy place to go through when they want to commit this crime. So to that extent, I think the national strategy can actually bring about effective criminal justice responses to wildlife and forest crimes. But as I mentioned, corruption is still a problem for Nigeria, and as long as corruption is not seriously tackled, wildlife crime will continue in Nigeria. There are no two ways about it. But fortunately, the national strategy, includes some sub-objectives around this. And so you have objectives around getting the government agencies involved to commit to zero tolerance of corruption. Also, one of the expected outputs is for these responsible government agencies to undergo corruption risk assessments, and also implement corruption risk mitigation measures. I understand that the UNODC is already leading on this. On the unhealthy rivalries, between these agencies, the national strategy provides for an operational task force to be housed physically in a fusion center. And my hope is that properly carried out, all these objectives, will be sufficient to ensure that corruption and unhealthy interagency rivalries don't derail the implementation of the national strategy.
Okay, and Justin, just briefly, Philip mentioned that the state of play in Nigeria at the moment is kind of a bit like the Wild West for wildlife crime. How confident do you feel that this strategy's got the makings to make a severe dent and start taming that?
I'm not sure confident is the word, but I think we have to be optimistic. I mean, we've seen extraordinary developments in tackling wildlife crime in other regions of the world, Southeast Asia. We've seen that in East Africa. Nigeria is a significant hub for wildlife trafficking, but it's one of a number of countries in Western Central Africa that is facing problems. But there's encouraging responses, and I think this strategy is encouraging, and I think we need to work together to try and address that. We certainly met and worked closely with various representatives from national agencies, and they seem keen to work together. That's challenging all over the world. I mean, I've been working in law enforcement for over 30 years, and it's a problem in the country I worked in, which is the UK, getting agencies to cooperate, and they've all got different roles, and sometimes those overlap, so they're complicated. I think this is a good opportunity to also, for us to highlight the difference between, say, EIA and other organizations that are quite similar. I mean, something EIA has done since it was founded in 1984 is try to work for sustainable change. So rather than just simply tackling the symptoms of the problem, we're trying to tackle the causes of it and get long-term results. So when we conduct investigations, the objective is to gather evidence that can bring about long-lasting change to tackle the conditions that allow wildlife traffickers to exist. Getting seizures of dead animals and arresting wildlife criminals is surprisingly straightforward. It's not rocket science, to use a bit of a cliche, but actually securing sort of sound, just convictions that actually lead to deterrence and prevention in the long term is much more difficult. So I think this strategy and the work that EIA and ANI and others are doing in the region need to focus on those long-term goals. I mean, we know this is urgent. We want to see quick results, but it's with something as complex as this in a challenging region, those results are going to take a long time. So we got to be realistic, but we've also got to focus on where we're going to get long-term strategic change rather than quick hit results. And I think that's where we're all working together on that.
Indeed. Well, I hope you'll all come back down the line some point and give us an update as to how things are going. In the meantime, Wilson, Philip and Justin, thank you very much for joining us all today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Now, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please watch this space for future episodes and check out our website at eia-international.org to find out more about our work. Thanks very much for joining us today, and wherever you are, stay safe out there.